All right, guys, so today we are talking about solving quadratic equations by completing the square. This is section 5, topic 7 in Math Nation. Okay, and it's all about completing the square. So far, we have learned how to solve quadratic equations by factoring and by taking square roots. This method of completing the square is basically a combination of the two. We're using what we know from factoring and we're using what we know from square roots, and we're going to combine it to complete the square. So step 1, we're going to move the constant to the other side of the equal sign. Okay, so if you remember with factoring, we wanted everything to equal 0. Well, now with completing the square, we want to take this constant and we want to move it over to that side of the equal sign. So step 1, we're going to subtract 8 from both sides, and we get x squared plus 6x equals 0. Okay, then we're going to move on to step 2. Step 2 says to divide b by 2 and square it. So our b term, and I'm going to highlight that in pink, okay, because if you remember correctly from factoring, our b term we always highlighted in pink. So we're going to take that b term, 6, we're going to divide by 2, and we're going to square it. So this is step 2 over here. So when we take 6 and we divide by 2, we're going to get 3, and 3 squared is equal to 9. Okay, so we took our b, divided by 2, and we squared it, and we got 9. Now step 3 is add the number from step number 2 to both sides of the equation. Okay, so we're going to take that number 9 and we're going to add it to the equation. So now we're on step 3. So we're going to have x squared plus 6x plus 9 is equal to, and I didn't catch it before, that equation needs to be equal to -8 because I subtracted 8 from both sides. So it's going to be equal to a -8 plus 9, because whatever I add on the left side of the equation, I have to do on the right so that I have an equivalent equation. Okay, so I added 9 to both sides, and that was step 3. Now for step 4. I'm going to factor the perfect square trinomial into a binomial squared. So what we did in step 3 is we made the equation a perfect square trinomial. And we've talked about that a few times in our notes. And you also talked about perfect square trinomials in your Algebra Nation homework. So if you have not done your homework for last week or this week, you might be slightly confused because you're only hearing me talk about it but not seeing what it actually is. So we need to factor the perfect square trinomial into a binomial squared. So we created a perfect square trinomial. So now to factor it, it's really easy because this is just going to be x plus 3 squared. And that will be equal to -8 plus 9 will be 1. Now we need to solve the equation by taking the square roots, which is what we did yesterday in our notes. So now we can solve the equation by taking the square roots. So for step 5, we're going to take the square root of x plus 3 squared, and we're going to take the square root of 1. So x and I should write that with the parentheses. So x plus 3 is equal to 1, and x plus 3 is equal to a negative 1. So that means x is equal to, because if I subtract 3 and subtract 3, x will be equal to a negative 2. And over here, if I subtract 3 and subtract 3, x is equal to a negative 4. So those are my two solutions, because just like yesterday, we have to add in that step 6, which is just solve for x. Okay, we can't forget to solve for x as our last step. And that's all we did here was x plus 3 and set it equal to our positive 1, x plus 3, set it equal to our negative 1. And then we found our solutions, x equals negative 2 and x equals negative 4. All right. So those are our steps that we're going to follow each and every time when we are completing the square. So let's do a few of these practice problems below and follow our steps. So x squared plus 2x minus 24 equals 0. Our step 1 is to move the constant to the other side. So we're going to take this negative 24 and we have to add 24 to both sides. And we get x squared plus 2x equals 24. That was our step 1. Okay, step 2, I'm going to do off to the side. Step 2, we take our b term, which in this case is 2. We're going to divide it by 2, and we're going to square it. Well, 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 1 squared is equal to 1. So for step 3, we're going to add the number from step number 2 to both sides of the equation. So we're going to have x squared plus 2x plus 1, right? Because that's our b divided by 2 squared. And that will equal 24 plus 1. We're always going to leave that blank spot there to fill in that b term because we are completing the square. That's what we are doing. Okay, so now we can simplify and we're going to get x squared plus, oops, actually, I can rewrite that as a perfect square trinomial now for my step 4, which is factor the perfect square trinomial into a binomial squared. So we can go ahead and do that in step 4 now. So that factored x squared plus 2x plus 1, because I just created a perfect square trinomial, is going to be x plus 1 squared. And that is going to equal 25. Okay, so all I did was factor that perfect square trinomial that I just created so that now I can do step 5, which is solve the equation by taking the square roots. So now I can move along to step number 5. So I'm going to take the square root of x plus 1 squared, and that's going to equal the square root of 25. Now my 6th step, well, not quite yet. So now I'm going to have x plus 1 is equal to plus or minus 5. So then I can just move over here to my step 6, which is just solve for x. Okay, so I'm going to have x plus 1 is equal to 5. So I'll subtract 1 and subtract 1. X is equal to 4. And then I'll have x plus 1 is equal to a negative 5. I'll subtract 1 and subtract 1. And x is equal to a negative 6. I'm going to see if I can move that whole thing up so that I'm not going into the next box. But now we have all of our solutions for this equation. Just going to move these all up. That's the one thing I don't want to highlight. Oh, well, that's okay. So let's move on to number 2. Okay, we have x squared minus 16x plus 25. So our first step is going to be to move that positive 25 over to the other side of the equal sign. So we're going to get x squared minus 16x equals a negative 25. Remember, if it's positive on the left and remove it to the right, it's going to be the inverse, the opposite. Okay, so now that we've done step number 1, now we can move on to step number 2, which is to find our missing term, which is where we complete the square. So we're taking this b term here, negative 16x, negative 16. We're going to divide by 2, and we're going to square it. Negative 16 divided by 2 is going to be a negative 8. And when you square negative 8, you're going to get 64. Okay, so that's our missing c term that we need to add in order to complete the square. So now we're going to do that in step 3. So step 3, we're going to have x squared minus 16x plus the number we just found, 64, and that's going to equal negative 25 plus 64, because we were adding back in that term that we just found with our negative b over 2a. I'm sorry, b divided by 2 squared. I just gave you the vertex formula instead of completing the square formula. All right, so now we're on to step 4. In step 4, we are going to factor our now new perfect square trinomial. So x squared minus 16x plus 64 is going to be x minus 8 squared. And the reason why I have this negative sign instead of the positive sign that I had before is because my b term is negative. Okay, so x minus 8 squared is going to be equal to negative 25 plus 64, which is equal to 39. Okay, now we can move on to step number 5. So x, we're going to take the square root of x minus 8 squared. We're going to take the square root of that, just like we did yesterday. when we were solving by square roots, and that's going to equal the square root of 39. So that means that x minus 8 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 39. 39 can be divided by 3, and it's 13, but those are both prime numbers. So there's no way for us to simplify the square root of 39. So that means for step 6, our answer is just going to be x minus 8 equals the square root of 39. So we're going to add 8 to both sides. And x is equal to the square root of 39 plus 8. There's nothing we can do to simplify that any further. So that is one of our answers. And then we also have x minus 8 is equal to a negative square root of 39. So we add 8 and add 8. And x is equal to negative square root of 39 plus 8. Okay. Again, we will be leaving these in radical form. So if you have the square root sign, that means it's going to have the radical. That is the radical. So just be used to using that notation because we don't want to use decimals. We want to use the radical form. All right. We're going to do number 3 and number 4 in a separate video. Okay, so number 3 and number 4 I will do in a separate video, but you have the notes and we've done that first example problem and the second example problem. So use these notes, ask questions during class if you're confused. You have both Tuesday and Wednesday to complete this assignment. Bye guys, have a great day.